Hello students, it's your history teacher and I'm here with another online lecture. Today I will talk about the changes that were brought by the 80s and also about the situation that was before the 80s. Mostly it will be about the satellites of the Soviet Union that also Czechoslovakia was part of, and about the relations between the two blocs. During more than 30 years of rivalry and competition, the communist world managed to keep pace with Western world of capitalism. We had there more examples as scientific progress. The USSR was the first one with artificial satellite in the orbit and also the first human Yuri Gagarin in the orbit. However, the 1980s brought a set of economic, political and social problems that challenged the strength and unity of the Eastern Bloc. And mostly all these problems were challenging the satellites of the Eastern Bloc to reconsidering their trust to the USSR. Prior to the crisis in the 80s, there were several instances of tensions and problems between the USSR and its satellites in Central Europe. The great example is Hungary and also Czechoslovakia. So in Hungary, we are talking about the conflict that happened in 1956, when after some series of reforms, it was intervened by the Army of Warsaw Pact. The same thing happened after 12 years in Czechoslovakia. So in 1968, during the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was democratization of Czechoslovakia, because one politician, Alexander Dubček, wanted to establish communism with human face. That was not accepted by the Moscow. So again, the Army of Warsaw Pact intervened. You can see the picture from that event. So when the tanks came and then occupied our country, so people were protesting in the streets. So these revolutions that happened as a result of de-Stalinization during the government of Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, these interventions confirmed that the Soviet leaders would not allow their allies to follow their own independent policies. But this was about to change in the 80s by Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last representative of the USSR. The other thing I will talk about today is the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The Soviet army invaded Afghanistan to support the newly established communist government that faced opposition from nationalistic and religious Afghani rebels who were called Mujahideen. I wanted to remember this name. I know it can be quite difficult. You do not need to be specific about the spelling, but at least the pronunciation. So it's Mujahideen. The strength of the army grew, but it was unable to get the country under control despite the terrible casualties. So Soviet army grew, and at its peak it had over 100,000 troops, but still was not able to get the country under control. And here I have a little error. I meant despite the terrible casualties that the Soviet army caused to Mujahideen. Okay, so the Soviet army grew. It was strong, but unable to get country under control, despite the terrible casualties that Soviet army caused to Mujahideen. Probably up to 100,000 Mujahideen were killed in a combat, while it's estimated that over 1 million civilians may have died as a result of the fighting and the Soviet terror. Okay, so it's uncomparable how the Soviet army basically caused more harm to innocent civilians than to the Afghani rebels. Resistance of these Mujahideen, so these Afghan rebels, was possible mostly because, guess what? US military support. So once again, Mujahideen were supported by the United States because they wanted to stop the communism from spreading, and the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan to support the newly established communist government. The Mujahideen led guerrilla war and kept on resisting until the Soviets withdrew the last troops in 1989. And they mostly did so because during that time, the USSR was crumbling. In 1989, there were basically revolutions going on all over the Eastern Bloc. So they had other problems to solve. The Berlin Wall fell during that year. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia changed the government. So they had really other problems. And as I told you, this fighting in Afghanistan and the invasion of the Soviet army to this territory caused over 1 million civilian deaths as result of the fighting and the Soviet terror, but also several million of these Afghani people fled the country. So they became refugees because they didn't want to die in the fighting. This war in Afghanistan badly damaged the reputation of the Soviet army and its government, and also contributed to the downfall of the USSR. Okay, so that is very important. So in this war, the Soviet army was not just supporting someone, they were the ones who invaded the country and treated its people in really bad way. So that's why it destroyed its reputation and, among a lot of other things, contributed to the downfall of the USSR. So that's it for today, and we have just one more topic in front of us, so study on regular basis because the test is approaching. Okay, so until the next online lecture, bye.